So welcome and thank you for joining us today as we share the barriers that exist in the organic blueberry supply chain in Canada and explore strategies to overcome these barriers. My name is Marla Carlson and I'm chair of the Organic Value Chain Advisory Committee and I'm moderating today's webinar. We are pleased to be offering simultaneous interpretation in French today. And if you would like to access the interpretation, you'll just note on the bottom right-hand side of your screen an interpretation button. So just click on that and you can access the French channel. So the Canadian Organic Growers Office is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We would like to recognize the many important contributions Indigenous peoples have made and continue to make. We also want to acknowledge the injustices, both past and present, and encourage settlers to learn the history of the land which specific First Nations inhabited and which First Nations currently reside nearby your place of residence as a minimal and initial first step towards reconciliation. To learn more about the history of your area, please go to Whose Land. Before we really get going with the webinar, we're just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions, we would encourage you to put those in the Q&A box. And please, as the question comes up for you, please just put them in there so that we have them ready to go at the end of the presentation. And we would also encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourself so we know where everybody is from, and also just to have a conversation maybe amongst the folks who are here today. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recorded webinar will be available within 2 business days of the broadcast, and you can access it on the COGS YouTube channel. So you'll see the agenda up there in front of us. We're going to have a presentation on the findings for the organic blueberry value chain, then followed by a presentation on proposed strategies, followed by discussion and questions and answers. So today we will examine and discuss the challenges and opportunities within the organic blueberry supply chain. These findings are from the Canadian Access Project, a 2-year initiative by Canadian organic growers, managed by David Mazur-Goulet as project lead. You can also connect with David in the chat. This project engaged stakeholders across the country to determine the barriers that stand in the way of increasing production and sales of 6 organic crops or sectors. COG and their partners specifically examined organic carrots, beef, blueberries, salad greens, oats, and organic field peas in Canada. The Canadian Access Project is funded in part by the Government of Canada through the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Canadian Agricultural Strategic Priorities Program, a $50.3 million 5-year investment to help the agricultural sector adapt and remain competitive. And just one final thing before I hand over to Dawn is we'd like you to answer a quick poll for us, I believe. So that will be our next slide, or we're going to just, because we'd like to get a little bit of an idea of who's here with us today. So if you could take a moment and answer the poll, that would be excellent. And maybe as you're answering the poll, I'll take a minute and introduce Dawn. So Don Murray is the senior consultant with Harry Cummings and Associates, and he will be presenting the findings of their research and proposed strategies to overcome barriers. And we'll just wait, and we're going to show the results of the, excellent. So it looks like we have a good cross-section of folks here today, which is really, really great and reflective of the value chain and the research. So thank you all for being here and participating today. And without further ado, or more words from me, over to Dawn.
Thanks, Marla, and good morning and early afternoon to everyone that has joined us for this session today. We're scheduled to run for about an hour. I'll do what I can to get through this material within that hour. We'll see, and hopefully make sure we have some time at the end for some Q&A as well. Just quickly, what we'll be doing as part of this session, I'm initially going to walk the group through our research methodology. Then I'll provide a high-level snapshots of some of the figures around organic blueberry production in Canada in the context of also the conventional blueberry production, again, just to provide as a reference point for production activity. And then we'll move on to sharing a number of the constraints and barriers associated with production, processing, and retailing, and some corresponding strategies for responding to those issues. As a starting point, though, I'd like to touch on the research methodology that we used for looking at the barriers and constraints with the blueberry supply chain. In the process of this research, we looked at both wild berry production. Wild berries are also known as low bush berries, and we looked at the cultivated blueberry sector. Cultivated berries, also known as high bush or referred to as high bush berries. So we used a variety of methods to collect information and observations on barriers in both of these sort of blueberry types. Key informant interviews were a key component of this, and we identified a number of stakeholders through with the support of the Organic Value Chain Advisory Committee. So we asked that group to help us in identifying relevant stakeholders to invite to participate in interviews. And ultimately, about 30 stakeholders in total were initially invited to participate in the study, and 10 stakeholders took us up on that invitation and did participate in an interview. 5 of that 10, they were actually organic blueberry producers. 2 were wild blueberry producers, and 3 were cultivated producers. But of those 5, they were also typically involved in marketing activities, and a couple were also involved in some processing activities as well. And then we had 3 standalone or separate sort of distributed retailers and 2 standalone processors that participated in interviews with us. Those producers that we spoke to represent different scales of production, so ranging from 13 acres to 20 acres to 50 acres, and at least one that was 5,000 plus acres. And they represent 3 provinces: BC, Ontario, and Quebec. We also heard from relevant stakeholders that participated in the Eastern Ontario Supply Chain Meeting stakeholder panels. This was a series of panels that were conducted last spring. And as part of that, there was a panel that focused on fruit production in Eastern Ontario, or the fruit supply chain in Eastern Ontario. And there were at least 2 organic wild blueberry producers that sat on that panel. Other relevant data collection that was sort of included as part of this research were the findings from the National Survey of Organic Stakeholders that was conducted in March of 2021. And this resulted in a response of over 370 stakeholders. At least 200 of those were involved in some form of crop production, be it grains, vegetables, fruit. Now, although the survey did not specifically focus on organic blueberries, many of the findings we found really served to reinforce and validate the themes that were coming out of the research we did with the key informant interviews and the others, even the background lit review that we did. And also then there was also a virtual roundtable discussion that was hosted by COG at the Guelph Organic Conference, again, last year, where there was a panel dedicated to looking at supply chain barriers. And again, although the roundtable did not specifically focus on organic blueberries, the discussion was relevant to the focus of our topic, and again, helped to reinforce and validate the findings that we were coming across as part of this study. So quickly, a snapshot of organic blueberry production sales in Canada. And I'd like to just sort of maybe step back a little bit and talk about the big picture when we think about blueberries as a whole, so organic and non-organic. Blueberries are Canada's most important fruit crop in terms of farm gate sales. Combined organic and non-organic sales amounted to almost 274 million in 2020 on an acreage base of about 190,000 acres in Canada. Canada is the second largest commercial producer of blueberries in the world, following the US. And blueberries also represent our leading fruit export, accounting for just over 60% of the total fruit export value in 2020. As I mentioned earlier, Canada produces two types of blueberries, the wild blueberries and the cultivated blueberries. And both types of these berries are harvested in the summer through to early autumn. And while wild blueberries are a native plant to Eastern and Atlantic Canada, the cultivated blueberry variety is largely concentrated in British Columbia, which accounts for about 96% of the cultivated blueberry crop. There certainly is some cultivated crop production taking place in Eastern Canada. In fact, there was one of the producers in Ontario that we spoke with is a cultivated blueberry producer. So it's not exclusive to Western Canada, and it's interesting to see that there are opportunities and potential for growth in other parts of Canada for the cultivated variety. Now, the data provided by the organic certifying bodies helped us sort of begin to develop a profile of just how big the organic sector is in Canada right now. And we know that there are at least 263 producers that are growing organic blueberries in Canada in 2020 on a land base of at least 21,300 acres, right? And that's a combination of both wild and cultivated in terms of those producer numbers and that acreage value. Unfortunately, the way that the data is provided by the certifying bodies, we're not able to make a distinction between the wild blueberry component and the cultivated component, but we do have a sense of what the total industry looks like. That total acreage in any extent, that 21,300 acres of production represents about 11% of the total Canadian blueberry production when you factor in non-organic and organic. And we also want to emphasize it's important to acknowledge that the figures on organic production really, in our minds, represent minimum estimates, as not all certifying bodies collect and report data in the same way. Again, from the information that was tabulated through the certifying bodies, we know that organic blueberry producers are located in at least 7 provinces. In particular, large concentrations are in Quebec and British Columbia, wild blueberries in Quebec and largely cultivated berries in BC. And a significant proportion of the total organic blueberry production area is concentrated in Quebec, again, associated with that wild berry production and the large plots of land for that. Total farm gate value of wild organic blueberry, we estimate this to be as much as 11.6 million for the wild organic, and then about almost 45 million in farm gate sales associated with the cultivated organic blueberry. So cultivated blueberries typically yield higher than wild. So it's interesting that we have a higher acreage for wild blueberries, but we have a higher sales value for cultivated. And again, it comes back, or it's partly related to the fact that there's a higher yield associated with cultivated blueberries. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is that the production figures here don't reflect or take into consideration the impact of this most recent year with the severe weather events, right? So there was, for example, in BC, the heat dome and the flooding in the Fraser Valley in 2020, in this past year, which significantly impacted cultivated berries. We also know there were weather events in Eastern Canada, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit during the presentation. But this is, again, not something that's just arrived on the horizon. Weather-related events have had a significant impact on blueberry production in general over the last few years. When we look at the blueberry sector as a whole, organic and non-organic combined, production has dropped by as much as 16% just in 2020 alone as a result of extreme weather events, and impacted both high bush and the low bush varieties. We know also as well that low bush, the wild blueberries, have been in steady decline since 2016 as a result of consecutive seasons of extreme weather events and a decline in harvested area, while cultivated production has increased over the same period, and that's largely due to a steady increase in the planted area. When we look at the importation of organic blueberries, we see there's a substantial number here, at least in 2019, almost $35 million worth of organic blueberries being imported into Canada. It's a combination of wild and cultivated varieties. So really something here of an import substitution opportunity. And this was also confirmed by some of the processors and retailers that we spoke with, who confirmed that they are buying their imports to make up for shortfalls. And this imported value has grown over time. It's actually grown by 12 million over 2016 and 2017 import values. In terms of retail sales of non-organic and blueberries, the estimate that we've come up with when we've looked at retail data for all blueberries, non-organic and organic, is about 332 million. And of that amount, blueberries or organic blueberries account for about 15%, or $50.2 million in sales. And again, those retail sale values are estimates. So again, it's a figure that we know that that's only a partial profile of what that data is telling us. So we're going to move now on to a few of the constraints, barriers that we heard about as part of our research process. Starting with the issue of land suitability and fitness. One of the sort of major constraints of blueberries is that they have specific criteria, production criteria, that are different from most other agricultural crops. Ideally, they need soils that are well drained. They need to have a low pH, typically in the range of 4.5 to 5 pH. And they also need a high organic matter content. Now, it is possible to grow blueberries on heavier soils that have a higher pH, but this requires a higher degree of monitoring, will likely require soil amendments like sulfur to try and bring that pH level down. And it typically requires more sort of frequent nutritional adjustments for the soil quality. It's generally not advised, though, to grow blueberries on native soils with a pH above 6.2. But this background information then is pretty crucial for producers to know when attempting to start a blueberry farm or buy an existing blueberry farm, right? It's important to understand the requirements for maintaining that soil pH and the related nutrients in order to optimize production. And it's also important to have this background knowledge for the purpose of pre-ordering inputs in advance to ensure that they're available at the proper treatment window or the application time for the soil amendments or nutrients to optimize production of that crop. In terms of strategies, we suggest identifying and confirming locations that are best suited for cultivated and wild blueberry production to assist producers in establishing viable operations. In fact, we heard from a producer in a part of the country had experimented with blueberries and were determined after the fact that the soil conditions really were not the most applicable or appropriate for that purpose. It might be worth giving consideration to then even developing a land inventory of the most suitable locations for consideration. And along with that, that consideration would include what's the access to farm inputs and markets looks like as well, in terms from a farm viability standpoint. We would also encourage ongoing support for producers in accessing relevant information on best practices for growing blueberries in optimal and suboptimal conditions, right? Where those constraints aren't too severe to be overcome with the use of soil amendments and other nutrients. Right, so another major barrier with land affordability and availability. And this is a fairly consistent barrier that has come up across all the commodities that we've been looking at so far. So with the beef, with the carrots, it's going to come up again with the salad greens, it's going to come up again with the oats and the field peas. It is across the board, right? Ongoing concerns about the cost of entry into farming or expanding the existing land base being prohibitive as a result of the high land valuation and or the limited availability of suitable lands. In the case of blueberries, renting and leasing land is not really an attractive or practical option. given the time and investments associated with blueberry production, it takes time for the bushes to get established, and then it can be multiple years for that for those plants to actually reach their peak production. And another sort of issue with land rental anyways is that these days land is also costly in terms of rent and affordability issues. And there are also corresponding or related issues around lack of suitable infrastructure on that rented land or incompatible surrounding land uses. Now, land cost in the BC Fraser Valley is a particular problem where the cultivated blueberry production is concentrated. And it's also working alongside other intensive agricultural activities. So it's difficult to consider transitioning to organic blueberry production in this region, given the risk of herbicide, pesticide contamination from spray drift and the need for a buffer zone. When you sort of have to have how do you justify that sort of allocation of land to a buffer zone, given the high land values in the area? You really, if you're on and working that land, you want to maximize every dollar coming off of every square meter of that property. And for producers that are currently operating in the Fraser Valley, there's just, in terms of expansion, the high level of competition from other, for land from other agri-sector interests. This issue of land cost and availability really came up strongly in the national survey that was conducted last year across Canada. So this is a consistent issue, as I mentioned, that is of concern to producers and the growth of the organic industry going forward. In terms of strategies going forward, we suggest developing and supporting land matching programs to help organic producers find land to purchase and ensure that this service is offered in conjunction with other relevant business support services. So what are some of these other matching programs look like? Farm linking, for example, helps to pair new organic farmers with retiring organic farmers, and it enables the farm to pass to the next generation of producers, even where there is no family bond or no family member to go to. And a potential role there as well for retiring farmers to mentor younger farmers to ensure the business remains viable, and then ultimately transfer ownership through an innovative or cooperative financing arrangement. Also look at cooperative farming models where a group of young farmers might pool together where they can gain enough capital to buy or lease a farm they can share. And this works especially well where the business model elements complement each other. So it could be an individual has an interest in the production side of it, an interest producer that, or a stakeholder who has an interest in the processing side of it, and then another individual maybe who wants to focus on marketing activities. There's also a big role here for government, and many of the stakeholders we spoke to felt that government needs to take and have be a stronger partner in advancing production and value-added opportunities in the organic blueberry sector through supportive policies and regulations. So, for example, there's a feeling that within the regulatory environment, governments should be looking at reviewing and making more allowances for on-farm infrastructure development, buildings, light processing activities, driveway and farmway upgrades, those types of allowances where maybe currently the official plans or policies are prohibiting activities in that area. And also roadside advertising, right? Making allowances for that. And not just with allowing these types of activity to take place, but also providing the complementary funding programs to strengthen and support that on-farm infrastructure development. A stakeholder that we spoke to also emphasized the importance of government-backed funding programs making more allowances for first-year farmers and young entrepreneurs to access grant money, as this is a key period where businesses need the support to help cover their startup costs. So the issue of startup and transitioning, again, a key issue that sort of gets in the way of producers taking that leap, right? Starting a business is time and a resource. It's a huge time and resource commitment. And in particular with organic, for many, it's a matter of having to acquire and adopt new knowledge and practice techniques, right? And even in some cases, having to sort of look at new marketing techniques and securing marketing channels. And then there's also the added sort of time that's needed for, to be dedicated to the record keeping that goes with establishing and maintaining the certification for organic production. Now, some stakeholders noted that they're finding the relevant resources they need to support production planning and decision-making is dispersed. It's not the easiest information to find. It's not the easiest information to navigate through. For example, one producer talked about struggles they had with obtaining more information on the soil amendments and the soil treatments to consider, and also trying to identify the most appropriate blueberries to experiment with in their particular region. It was also suggested that new farmers need support and guidance in learning about and navigating the relevant government programs, such as farm tax programs, agri-stability insurance programs, and other relevant grant programs. Another key factor addressed or identified by stakeholders is that the certification process needs to be efficient and easy to navigate to encourage, again, uptake of the organic model. One producer emphasized the need to adopt standardized electronic data forms in the certification process so that the data can be carried forward from year to year, almost like pre-populated data files, so that if you're not modifying anything in the previous production previous production year, that data can just be carried forward and it just completes the forms automatically. So only minimal changes have to be made where needed, as opposed to having to start the script from the beginning and enter everything. There was also a suggestion from a stakeholder that really certifying bodies, where possible, should try and limit the number of changes that they're making to the application form from year to year, and also provide more support and just helping producers navigate through the application process when they're sort of starting out. Now, with the startup and transitioning piece, cost is also a key consideration or issue with the blueberry sector. Some stakeholders noted that there is a significant disincentive to starting a new blueberry farm or transitioning to organic blueberries when that income is going to be depressed in the initial years. One, because if it's a new farm, the blueberry doesn't, it takes a few years to get the bushes established, and the sort of optimal yield isn't sort of occurring for a few years. And if they're transitioning from an existing blueberry farm to organic, again, it's that transition period where they're not going to initially sort of capture that premium on the organic product until they've had a chance to sort of let that environment rehabilitate over. And also conventional producers considering transitioning to organic might be put off by the drop in yield and the reduction in income while the farm transitions. And any drop in income is especially concerning for growers that are located in areas where land values are at extreme ranges, and they need to maximize their return on every meter of acreage or every meter of land. This issue of the cost of transitioning to organic also came up in the national survey as a significant challenge, and also in the Guelph Roundtable on supply chain barriers. So again, looking at what we can do where possible to ease and facilitate entry into organic is, the things that are within our control versus the things that are outside of our control, and really where we need to sort of make sure that we pay attention to what we can do to enable producers. So as part of that, we're looking at the strategy of developing and strengthening knowledge transfer points and ensuring that access is convenient and affordable, right? Information on transitioning to organic and ongoing advancements in production, processing, and marketing should be organized and consolidated for easy and efficient access. There needs to be better collaboration between all the producer sort of stakeholder agencies, the certifying bodies, the research institutions, to look at and governments to look at reinvesting in extension services for the organic sector that are timely, relevant to local conditions, and easy to access. And we would also say that there's a need to work with the research institutions to address these challenges around intellectual property agreements. to ensure that access to information isn't held by corporate bodies and that it can be accessed freely as much as possible. We would also emphasize that it's important to ensure that the certification process is easy to navigate, sufficient, and consistent. Right? Again, this should not be the biggest constraint. This should be an element where having to do the certification paperwork on a year-to-year basis is seen as being supportive and helpful in planning production activities. And maybe even there's a role here at some point for certifying bodies to look at ways they can provide scenarios or examples of how, as a producer goes through and completes these forms, this is how it can inform production systems, planning activities, so that they have a sort of sense of, what other value added can I get out of having to document these activities? What other application does it have that might be helpful for certifying bodies to sort of provide some of that? Here's what else you can do with the data. Again, I can't say for sure that they're not already doing that, but it came up as a suggestion that that is something that stakeholders would like to see. Certifying bodies could already be doing that. Maybe it might be the case that the messaging just isn't getting out there that is also available. Right, so I want to talk a bit about weed and pest control challenges, which came up as a major barrier. So weeds pose a number of challenges in blueberry production in particular. They compete for space, they compete for moisture and the nutrients that are in the soil, and which can ultimately then reduce blueberry plant vigor and yield, right? They can also, if they get large enough, they can shade the crop, resulting in poor bud formation. And those weeds alongside the crop can act as an alternate host for insects and diseases. Flowering weeds also compete with the crop for bee visitations, which is important for pollination. And ultimately, weeds can also interfere with irrigation and harvesting activities, right? So lots of issues with weeds in terms of how they can get in the way and interfere with production harvesting activities. It's in particular a big challenge with cultivated berries where, equipment can be used to manage the weeds, but again, it's a requirement of the operator to be quite skilled in working around those bushes to ensure that no damage is caused to the crop. And another issue that the stakeholder mentioned in terms of when you're relying on machine equipment for the weeding is that there are relatively few equipment manufacturers who are specializing in the equipment that they're using. And there's a risk or a threat that, if they go out of business or if the sales agent decides to stop selling that line of equipment or servicing that line of equipment, it's going to be difficult for them to access parts and service going forward. And it's also a bit of a, it's an investment issue as well with the equipment that has to be taken into consideration. Insect infestation was mentioned as an issue, in particular with cultivated berries. It's a major problem in the Fraser Valley. And again, this makes it more of an incentive for conventional producers to stay in the conventional stream because they have used to convenient pesticides to deal with that issue. In terms of vertebrates, this is where we get into other types of pests such as birds, bears, coyotes, and deer. In particular, those animals are issues, birds are issues in wild blueberry locations. Birds are a serious concern because they'll feed on the berries just as they're coming into the harvest period. Bears will damage and destroy honeybee hives that are used to increase pollination. And they'll also feed on the mature fruit and destroy plants. Deer, if they're in a high population, will cause a fair bit of damage simply by grazing on the leaves throughout the summer and then on the berries as they mature. And coyotes as well, if they have a high population, can consume a large amount of berries, but their presence can also reduce the damage caused by deer. So again, a win and a lose there with coyotes. With respect to cultivated blueberry production, again, birds are a big factor, a big concern, as I mentioned, because they will sort of tend to feed on berries as they're getting close to harvest. But also field mice or voles are a major issue, especially if the population is large. They can get in there underground, chew on the stems and the roots, impact the health of the plants and potentially even kill plants. And the issue with voles is that they do all this damage in the fall and the early spring. And so the producer really isn't even aware of the damage until you sort of get into a growth period and realize after the fact, the damage that has been done. I want to touch back on birds a bit because they do represent such a significant issue among the pests that growers have to deal with. And while there are a number of sort of remedies that are out there and deterrents that producers can use, they are imperfect, right? So for example, sonic boom and noise pest deterrents can be a nuisance to neighbors, and the birds may become accustomed to them. Similarly, birds may become accustomed to visual scare devices like scarecrows or balloons or streamers or flash tape. Some of the stakeholders we spoke to have experimented with falcons, and falcons can be effective, but they require a handler who can return to the site on a regular basis. Generally weekly is what the requirement is for the falcon to be effective. Another sort of key strategy used for keeping birds away then is also bird netting, which can be effective, but has a number of issues, including its high cost, the time it takes to install and take down the material, and also the fact that it can be easily damaged depending upon the quality of the netting that's put up. So some of the strategies, we recommend supporting research into the development, continued research into the development of bioherbicides and biopesticides / non-chemical approaches to weed control for wild and cultivated berries. And in conjunction with this, looking at the timing of the application of those bioherbicides and pesticides with other approaches like tilling, like the use of mulches for weed management, so that we're looking at what the optimal practices are when we use these different sort of approaches together. We also suggest supporting research, ongoing research into the development of bird management and control that can be more effective. And then also, of course, ensuring that relevant information on organic appropriate measures for weed prevention and management and bird control is disseminated, right? The issue of access to sufficient, reliable, and affordable labor has come up across all of the agricultural supply chains that we've looked at as part of this study. It was consistently flagged as an ongoing concern for producers and even other elements of the supply chain that support agriculture. So securing a sufficient and reliable pool of Canadian workers is challenging for a variety of reasons. There's just the general disinterest in farm work, the disinterest in seasonal work, issues with having to travel or relocate to the farm location is problematic for individuals. And so access to reliable, affordable labor through the temporary foreign worker program is crucial for many of the producers. And the situation with COVID-19, the pandemic, really intensely magnified the vulnerabilities in the food supply chain, especially the Canadian food system reliance on temporary foreign workers and their importance in supporting food security in Canada. This issue with labor vulnerability and issues really came up strongly as well in the national survey that was conducted. Over a third of the respondents said that this was a priority issue and a concern. And it also came up on the Guelph Roundtable as well in terms of an issue concern. So it's, again, this is not isolated for blueberries at all. This is sector wide. Coming back to some of the stakeholders that we spoke to on this matter, they noted that it's difficult to find reliable labor for their existing scale of production. Never mind even thinking about trying to expand. They're struggling just trying to maintain the scale of production they're at. And reliable labor is especially crucial for those operations that are using hand picking extensively, which is normally associated with a fair bit of the wild blueberry production. It's important for those operations that are using manual work that the workers be reliable and attentive, because if not, it can result in a lot of waste through fruit that's being picked that's unripe, fruit that's being dropped, or ripe fruit that's actually being left on the bush. Stakeholders also mentioned that there's challenges competing with other growers for that pool of berry pickers, and it's important to pay a good wage and find work for the team during slow periods to avoid losing them. Now, some of the producers we spoke to are using mechanical harvesting, and this can help to reduce the need for a large workforce of berry pickers. But there are also issues with this approach, as the shaker that's used in the mechanical harvester does not make a very good distinction between ripe and unripe berries. So berries have to be sorted or separated post-harvest. And again, there's also an issue with the cost of investment. So not all operators may be at that scale of activity where they can make a justification to put that investment into a mechanized harvester. One producer also raised an interesting concern about in the use of mechanized harvesting, how that is perceived by retailers and consumers as being an equally quality product versus a hand-picked blueberry. A bit of concern raised that retailers might be wanting to have a reduced price on mechanized berries that are picked through mechanical harvesting. But in fact, there's no, the producer was there is no difference really in the quality of mechanized versus hand-picked berries. And if anything, the producer feels that mechanized harvesting should be valued as it reduces the risk of potential contamination from human handling and contact. As I mentioned as well, this labor issue is not isolated to the farm. Other elements of the supply chain are also feeling this. And some of the processors and distributors that we spoke to talked about issues with finding labor to fill out their distribution activities with particular trucking into the US. And also the issue with COVID-19 disruptions and the flow of goods and services. It was challenging there for a period for processors to bring in their technical experts from the US to come in and service the equipment on site. So again, raising our awareness, and just wanted to be, to keep in mind that the US and Canada have very integrated supply chains, and the pandemic and border closure caused major issues during that period and ongoing. So strategy going forward, just ensuring that we're doing what we can with a temporary foreign worker program, that it is maintained and that the application and administration process is efficient and timely. And it's an important sort of reminder now, having sort of gone through this crisis, that we learn from the labor and cross-border travel disruptions that resulted from COVID-19, and that we have a robust system in place that is sufficiently prepared for similar types of disturbances in the future to protect the integrity of food supply chains. Great, so I want to turn to issues that are emerging with climate change related challenges. So producers have noted that there's been an increasing frequency of extreme weather events associated with climate change, and that it is impacting production activities and cycles, and producers are having to adapt more quickly to these changing conditions. In the BC context, stakeholders confirmed that 2021 was a very difficult year for the cultivated sort of blueberry sector, and it was especially bad for organic producers. Blueberries were destroyed or damaged by the flood conditions in November and the freezing temperatures that followed, which further sort of complicated the situation. Recovery is expected to be quite complicated and lengthy because of the damage caused to topsoil and the soil ecosystem that was disrupted, and the soil contamination as a result of the floodwaters bringing in garbage, pesticides, fertilizer, gasoline, diesel. And anyway, in any event, all of this is yet to be fully determined in terms of what this full impact is going to be. And for some producers, the recovery could involve a complete long-term rebuild of their operations. Earlier in the year, in June in BC, we had the heat dome that came through with excessive heat conditions. And heat with the blueberry crop can effectively serve to advance the plants ahead of the normal schedule. So it brings the fruit on quicker. And if they come all at once, then this creates labor challenges because suddenly you need your crew out there picking all at once to get that crop in for the fresh market. The heat will also cause the plant to go into a survival mode where everything goes into preserving the plant and not the fruit. And so the berries can shrink in size when exposed to too much heat. In the Ontario context, we heard from a stakeholder who noted that they were impacted by excessive rain and damp conditions this year, which resulted in fruit rotting on the bush. And we also heard from a producer in Quebec who noted that the unpredictability of weather and extreme weather events are going to be an ongoing issue facing the wild blueberry sector and the agriculture sector in general. In terms of strategies going forward, again, we want to emphasize the importance of supporting institutional research on climate resilient agriculture and ensuring this research is relevant and accessible to producers. Producers need to have access and be informed about climate adaptation best practices. It's important for them to be able to build on the knowledge base so that they have the confidence going forward in understanding climate change events and appropriate practices. We think it's also important that we support enhanced collaboration between all relevant stakeholders, producers, research institutions, certifying bodies and governments to advance organic farming systems. Farm practices associated with organic and regenerative farming support greater resilience in the context of climate variabilities, and research and practices will need to adapt, in ways such as development of drought tolerant crop varieties, water management strategies, soil conservation, nutrient recharge strategies, and so on. We also want to emphasize the importance of ensuring that appropriate flood, drought, fire mitigation strategies and infrastructure are in place to protect agricultural lands from extreme weather events. For sure, here in BC, there's going to be a major rethink about what we're going to have to be doing about the dike infrastructure to make sure that is adequately robust to handle a more frequent occurrence of these type of events going forward. So a little bit on the piece of a challenge as it relates to the processing side of things, in particular the challenges that some stakeholders are encountering in sourcing and processing organic blueberries specifically for the frozen market. Now, blueberries have a wild and a fresh market. Processors here have observed that there's considerable uncertainty from year to year in terms of how much cultivated blueberry product there will be, both the organic and the non-organic. It's difficult to determine the numbers or the volume that they'll be working with from year to year. And they emphasize that it's difficult to source organic cultivated blueberries from the BC population for the frozen market. In recent years, BC organic producers have been increasingly selling into the fresh market before considering selling into the frozen market. And they've been able to tap into a major market, the major Asian market for fresh blueberries, where they're getting a really sort of a premium price for that product. And the local buyers simply are not able to compete on the price they're getting for the overseas market. Now, the processors don't blame the organic growers for sort of taking the highest price that they can get, given the additional production risks and cost that they face versus conventional growers. But it is sort of forcing these processors that are looking for a product for their frozen blueberries to look elsewhere. And as a result, processors confirm that they're sourcing a good chunk of their organic blueberries from Washington and Oregon at this time. Another stakeholder observed in the processing side of it that it can be problematic for the industry to accommodate organic growers that want to sell into the frozen market because of issues of making room in the production cycle to handle a smaller volume of organic that comes through. They emphasize that these processing facilities are large in scale for sorting, packing, and freezing activities, highly mechanized. And in order to process a small batch of organic berries, they have to custom clean and sanitize the equipment, which can be costly. One processor provided the numbers where Well, they typically can handle upwards of 40,000 pounds of conventional blueberries in an hour. And if they have to stop and prepare the equipment to process, a 10,000 pound order of organic blueberries, it would be the equivalent of sacrificing about 100,000 pounds of conventional berries that they could have put through had they not sort of stopped the line to make room for that organic lot. So one strategy we're suggesting going forward here is just to ensure that we're doing what we can to facilitate and support communication and networking between organic producers and processors to try and pool production at the time of processing to gain efficiencies in that in the processing cycle for the capacity that is there. And then finally, I want to touch on some risks, threats, and opportunities related to the organic brand itself, right? So we've heard again across the different commodities that we've looked at, this ongoing concern around how the organic brand is losing its value in the marketplace against the proliferation of other eco-friendly branding that's out there. Branding that closely aligns with organic, but is not exclusively organic, such as the branding of non-GMO, natural products, sustainable products, and so on. And so it's as I said, it's alternative branding that might be aligned with organic, but it's not strictly organic. And producers, all stakeholders really are concerned about the importance of having full and truthful branding on food products to enable consumers to make informed choices. This was a major issue that also came up in the national survey that was conducted. About 44% of the respondents indicated that they feel that this is a real threat to the expansion of the organic sector if we don't sort of do some sort of check on the unregulated marketing claims that are out there. Stakeholders that we talked to in the blueberry sector noted that some consumer interest in organic has increased greatly, and they feel that the COVID situation has stimulated greater interest in local foods linked to concerns over food security. Producers also expressed their hope that there's going to be an ongoing interest in local products, and that this becomes a permanent shift, and that consumers won't revert back to price being the key consideration in purchasing when the pandemic comes to an end. However, there were some retailers and stakeholders that we spoke with who feel that maybe organic is getting close to its saturation point. And this is why it's important that the industry needs to look at alternative marketing and branding to ensure, one, it holds its existing sort of its market share, and potentially expands with trying to go after other elements of what would be potentially of interest to consumers, be it fair trade or sustainable farming or other sort of way to sort of to reach their speak to their values and interests. Yes, so there's a few. Also, I would say that there was a producer processor that strongly believes that the frozen fruit market in general will continue to grow as there have been significant improvements in technology over the years, and consumers are taking a greater interest in including a variety of fruit in their diet, in particular in smoothies that they can make at home. It was further emphasized that the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened interest in food security and food that can be preserved and stored for longer periods of time at home. Well, in terms of strategies going forward related to this, it's important to ensure that the marketing promotion of certified organic products enables consumers to easily differentiate the organic product from non-organic. It's important to promote the resilience of organic farms and their ability to help mitigate climate change. These are really important messages that we need to get out there. Need to reinforce in marketing campaigns to build on existing customer loyalty. But producers also emphasize that there's a role for retailers to take on more of an advocacy role in promoting organic products and not simply be providing the shelf space. They need to be part of in the game and being a voice and an advocate for this product as well, and informing consumers about the benefits of organic farming. Producers also noted that there are opportunities here, or we should be taking advantage of opportunities to find creative ways to help retailers break out of their customary selling and pricing approaches to help consumers opt into the organic option. So looking at things, for example, might we want to consider providing the consumer the option of paying a premium price on an organic product, with the tagline that it's going to be supporting organic producers and sustainable farm practices as an entryway to get them in. Of course, there'll be an ongoing important role for relevant provincial and federal governments, agencies to monitor and regulate eco-friendly marketing claims to ensure that they are truthful and not misleading. And with that, I'll draw the findings to an end. And I know that we are on an hour now coming up, but I'm happy to take questions and answers.
That's really great. Thank you, Don, for going through your findings so far. We do have one question that's come in, and the person is asking if there was any conversation in the study around on-farm fruit losses.
It didn't come up specifically, no. That's not to say that we still can't look at that. I'll go and sort of see what I can find if it, I said it didn't come up in our discussions, but there could be other material out there in the literature or reports that we could look at on on-farm fruit. Now, I'm wondering, with that conversation, is it also related to an alternative secondary use for damaged fruit, so that it's sort of reducing or finding an alternative market for fruit that's sort of not the it's not going into the fresh market. It may not even be suitable for the frozen market. But interestingly, I actually didn't mention it there. We did talk to one producer who a processor who's involved in making jams and jellies, and they talked about for them, it's not an issue of the fruit looking perfect, that they can take that, if it's got a sort of a slightly damaged skin, or if it's cracked, so long as the flavor is good and the sweetness is fine, that berry will still work in their processing. The consumer has no idea what that berry looked like. And so there are markets out there. And I think it's in the, I think I've actually noted in the report that, we need to do a better job of networking with those users of berries, those sort of seconds off grades, that can be used in these other sort of areas of processing.
For sure, and something that popped into my head, and is just this. I increasingly see in recipes like the use of freeze-dried fruit, and I don't know how that, if there is, clearly a secondary use, I would think, for like you were saying, the not the premium produce. So I do have, it's not really a question, but it's a comment, but I would like to read it out. And maybe you can comment on the comment, just on how it fits into what you've been hearing from other producers. So the question or the comment is, I personally find it difficult as a mid-sized producer to find the proper equipment and fund it. The other issue I find is the confusion on what it means to be certified organic. I have a large producer that is not certified organic, but tells customers, yes, we are organic. It's grown outside in nature. So raising the importance of why it is important to buy, true or certified organic products. So maybe throw that over to you for comment.
It's sort of, that is out there. That is, I appreciate that you have producers who are saying, I am farming in a natural way. These are my practices. I don't necessarily haven't gone through the process of certifying everything and sort of getting that sort of the credentialing that goes along with that, and the year-to-year upkeep on my records and so on. And but I think if you don't have a standard, that is sort of what the industry is sort of saying. That's our calling card. That is giving the consumer the guarantee that we are following these explicit standards. And you have an assurance that when you're paying for the product and the price that goes with it, that is what you're getting. I know it's a difficult one to sort of say, how do we sort of encourage or bring along that group that are sort of non-committed to certifying, or other barriers are getting in the way of them taking that step where it feels to them, or we can make it more so for them that it feels like it's an incentive, as opposed to, oh, it's another level of regulation, it's another cost that's being added to my production model. I just want to get on with the job of farming. I'm passionate about farming. Do I have to do all this record keeping that goes with it?
Mm. Yeah, and it's what it made me think about is, in the organic sector, from the beginning, the consumer or the eater has been really a part of our value chain, right, or our supply chain, and they are creating the demand which we're filling. And so for me, part of the answer to that question is, more consumer education. Right? It's like this is why, and this is why you should buy certified organic, or the benefits not only to yourself but to the environment of purchasing organic blueberries or other organic crops. And COG does a great job of of consumer education, Canada Organic Trade Association, and then the provincial industry associations. But I think that this is an area where we just have to keep promoting, keep working, keep educating, so that we so that consumers can make educated choices about how they're purchasing, or what they're purchasing.
It's quickly it's a valid
Yeah.
point on the piece about the equipment, that
Sure.
the affordability of that sort of equipment. It's a big investment. In some cases, the equipment isn't always the most appropriate fit. So it may even have to be modified somewhat to accommodate the use on the farm. And then getting the access to ongoing parts and services. Again, it's sort of, where is that support coming from the equipment sector to get behind organic and sort of treat it as a valid and a sort of going concern relative to the conventional side of it, that, they'll bring it in if you ask for it, or it's like, I'm actually dealing with 6 conventional producers today. Can't come out to the farm today, or whatever, sort of, you're going to have to, we need to sort of, again, talk up organic in terms of all the other elements of the supply chain, the inputs side of it, getting behind it in a bigger way.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I can't, of course, I can't remember the fund name off the top of my head, but nearing the end of last year, the federal government announced a program to support, I think it was the adoption of alternative energy and as a way to mitigate climate change on farms, and they were including in not just sort of how you produce electricity or power on your farm, but also things like interrow cultivators, so ways of adapting to mitigate climate change through the adoption of technology. Mm-hmm. And I know that for grain producers in particular, there was high application rate to that fund, and I know that it was oversubscribed. So what I'm hoping is that that is signaling that there is a need for some assistance in the adoption of technology on our farms. So yeah, but it is now 5 minutes past the hour, so I think we should probably finish off today's webinar. So I'll just have a few final words to say, and we'll sign off. So this webinar is an important milestone for the project and the Canadian organic growers. We would like to thank Harry Cummings and Associates, Canadian Organic Trade Association, and Sask Organics, as well as the many producers and stakeholders for their important contributions. We also want to acknowledge our appreciation of financial support provided by the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So join us for similar webinars covering the organic salad greens, oats, and field peas in the coming weeks. If you enjoyed the webinar today, please consider sharing information about our webinar series with your network. And we're just going to pop up another poll, so if you can let us know if you want to receive further information about those webinars. So we'll pop that poll up, and then my final words are that this event has been recorded, as has our past webinars, and they are all available for free on Canadian Organic Growers YouTube channel. So check those out as well, and hope to see you at future webinars. Have a great rest of your day.